The morning Ayanna Ridge discovered her father's blood on the cellar door handle changed everything, though she wouldn't understand the significance of that rust-colored stain until much later. At 16, she had developed a careful blindness to certain details of her life, a protective mechanism that allowed her to function in the strange liminal space between her Cherokee heritage and the modern world that constantly encroached upon their mountain sanctuary. The blood was old, oxidized to the color of autumn leaves, and she might have dismissed it as rust if not for the way it had preserved the distinctive whorls of a fingerprint she recognized from countless childhood memories of her father's hands teaching her to braid sweetgrass. Thomas Ridge had been missing for 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Ayanna knew this precisely because she marked each day in a journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, a practice that had begun as hopeful anticipation of his return and had gradually transformed into something more akin to a ritual of grief. The official investigation had concluded within 6 months, the tribal police and county sheriff agreeing that he had most likely fallen from one of the treacherous mountain paths during a storm, his body swept away by the swollen streams that could turn from trickles to torrents in minutes during the autumn rains. But Ayanna had never believed this convenient narrative. Her father knew every path, every stone, every root and branch of these mountains. He had walked them as a child, learned their secrets from his own father, and passed that knowledge to her during countless dawn hikes when the mist rose from the valleys like the breath of sleeping giants. The investigators had found his truck parked at a trailhead, his hiking boots missing from the house, and had drawn their conclusions with the casual certainty of people who had never truly known Thomas Ridge or understood the depth of his connection to this land. The morning of the discovery began with an unusual restlessness that pulled Ayanna from her bed before dawn. October had arrived with its characteristic mountain chill, and frost etched delicate patterns on her bedroom window that reminded her of the beadwork her grandmother created during the long winter evenings. Alysse was already awake, as she always was, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, listening to the Cherokee Phoenix radio station broadcast the morning prayers in both English and Salagi. "You're up early, grandchild," Alysse observed without turning from the window where she watched the darkness gradually give way to the pale light of pre-dawn. Her voice carried the musical cadence of someone who had learned English as a second language, though she had been born in Oklahoma and had lived her entire life navigating between 2 linguistic worlds. "The spirits are restless this morning." Ayanna had learned not to dismiss her grandmother's observations about the spiritual world, though she struggled to reconcile them with the secular education she received at the regional high school 40 minutes down the mountain. Alysse saw patterns and meanings in everything. The flight of birds, the direction of smoke from the chimney, the way shadows fell across the old photographs that lined their hallway. It was a way of understanding the world that felt both profoundly true and impossibly distant from the reality of algebra tests and college application essays. "I couldn't sleep," Ayanna admitted, pouring herself coffee from the pot that was always kept warm on the stove. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way 3 generations of Ridge women had prepared it, and she had learned to appreciate its harsh comfort even though her classmates preferred elaborate drinks from the Starbucks that had recently opened in the valley town. "I kept dreaming about Dad." Alysse's weathered hands stilled for a moment before resuming their gentle rotation of the coffee mug. Dreams of the dead, or the missing who might be dead, were not discussed lightly in their household. Dreams could be messages, warnings, or invitations, and the interpretation required careful consideration of countless factors that Ayanna only partially understood despite years of patient instruction from her grandmother. "What did he show you?" Alysse asked, using the traditional phrasing that acknowledged dreams as gifts from the spirit world rather than mere neurological phenomena. Ayanna struggled to articulate the strange imagery that had pulled her from sleep. "He was underground but not buried, more like waiting, and there were golden leaves falling, but they made sounds like coins when they hit the ground. She paused, aware of how absurd it sounded when spoken aloud. He was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand the words. He was speaking in the old language. This last detail was particularly troubling because Ayana's father had been adamant about speaking primarily English in their household, believing it would better prepare his daughter for success in the wider world. It was Alissi who had insisted on teaching her Tsalagi, often over Thomas's objections, and even then Ayana's comprehension remained frustratingly limited. The dream father speaking in the ceremonial language of their ancestors suggested something beyond ordinary communication. The old language carries truths that English cannot hold, Alissi said, rising from the table with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested the mountain dampness. Perhaps it's time you learn to listen with more than your ears. This cryptic statement was typical of Alissi's teaching method, which relied heavily on metaphor and indirect guidance rather than explicit instruction. It was an approach that had frustrated Ayana throughout her childhood, especially when she compared it to the clear, linear teaching methods of her school teachers. But she had learned that pushing for clarity often resulted in even more obscure responses, as if certain knowledge could only be approached sideways, like a deer in the forest that would flee if looked at directly. The morning routine continued with its familiar patterns: feeding the chickens, checking the garden for frost damage, preparing breakfast while Alissi listened to the radio. But Ayana felt a persistent pull toward the old root cellar, as if invisible threads were drawing her attention to that corner of their property. She had avoided the structure since childhood, when a family of copperheads had taken up residence there, and her father had declared it off-limits until he could properly seal all the gaps. But he had disappeared before completing that task, and the cellar had remained undisturbed, gradually being reclaimed by Virginia creeper and wild grapevines. It was while pursuing their escape artist hen, a Rhode Island red named Trouble who seemed to delight in finding new ways to evade capture, that Ayana found herself standing before the cellar door. The blood on the handle was immediately visible in the morning light, a dark stain that had somehow remained despite 3 years of weather. She knew it was blood rather than rust by the way it had preserved those identifying ridges and whorls, and she knew it was her father's by a recognition that went deeper than visual memory. The door, which should have been sealed shut by years of disuse, swung open at her touch. The hinges, which should have screamed with rust, moved in well-oiled silence. The darkness beyond seemed to breathe with a life of its own, exhaling the scent of earth and stone and something else, something metallic and sweet that made her throat tighten with inexplicable emotion. Trouble the hen, who had led her to this threshold, suddenly went quiet and still, as if even her bird brain recognized the significance of this moment. Gianna descended into the cellar using her phone's flashlight, each step feeling like a transgression against the careful boundaries that had structured her life since her father's disappearance. The space was larger than she had expected, extending beyond the simple root storage area into what appeared to be a natural cave system that had been partially improved with stonework. The walls showed tool marks that looked both ancient and fresh, as if time moved differently in this underground space. The chest sat in an alcove that had been carved from the living rock, positioned with deliberate care on a platform of fitted stones. It was military surplus, the kind sold at Army-Navy stores throughout the region, deliberately unremarkable except for its weight when she attempted to move it. The clasps opened easily despite showing no signs of regular use, and inside she found layers of history that had been carefully preserved and hidden. The gold was overwhelming in its quantity and variety. Confederate coins mixed with Spanish doubloons, Cherokee ceremonial pieces alongside raw nuggets that still carried traces of quartz matrix. There were items she recognized from museum displays, gorgets and ear spools that should have been in climate-controlled cases, documented and studied by scholars. There were pieces that belonged in private collections or bank vaults, Morgan silver dollars, St. Gaudens double eagles, gold certificates from the Federal Reserve. And beneath it all, wrapped in oilcloth and cedar shavings, were documents that would reshape her understanding of her family's history. The letter from her father was expected. She had somehow known it would be there from the moment she saw his blood on the door. But the other documents were revelations that came like physical blows. Land deeds dating back to the removal era, testimony from Cherokee survivors of the Trail of Tears, detailed accounts of gold hidden before the forced march west. Her family hadn't simply lived on this land for generations. They had been its guardians, protecting secrets that went back to the darkest period of Cherokee history. Thomas Ridge's letter explained the modern portion of the tale with characteristic precision. He had been part of a network that recovered Cherokee artifacts from private collections and museums, but the work went deeper than simple repatriation. They were attempting to reconstruct the scattered pieces of Cherokee wealth and culture that had been deliberately fragmented during centuries of colonization. The gold in the chest represented both recovered artifacts and funding for future operations. A war chest in the most literal sense for a conflict that had never truly ended. But the letter also revealed why he had disappeared. The network had been compromised by someone seeking personal profit rather than cultural restoration. Federal investigators were closing in, armed with enough information to destroy not just the individuals involved, but potentially the legal standing of the Cherokee Nation itself. Rather than risk exposing others, Thomas had chosen to vanish, taking with him knowledge that could have implicated dozens of people who were still working within the system to protect Cherokee interests. The weight of this inheritance, both literal and metaphorical, sent Ayanna stumbling back up the cellar stairs into a morning that suddenly seemed alien and dangerous. The familiar mountains looked like barriers rather than protection, and every car that passed on the distant highway might carry federal agents following 3-year-old leads that could still destroy her family. She found herself checking for surveillance, studying shadows, starting at unexpected sounds, infected by the paranoia that her father must have lived with for years. Alyssa was waiting in the kitchen, her face showing no surprise when Ayanna entered covered in cellar dust and cobwebs. "You found it," she said simply, not a question but an acknowledgement. "I wondered when the dreams would finally speak clearly enough for you to listen." The revelation that her grandmother had known about the cellar's contents all along should have been shocking, but Ayanna found herself accepting it with the same fatalistic recognition that had guided her descent into that darkness. Of course, Alyssa knew. She was the keeper of family secrets, the one who remembered stories that others forgot, who maintained connections that others didn't even know existed. Her pretense of ignorance had been another form of teaching, allowing Ayanna to discover truths in her own time rather than having them forced upon her. "What am I supposed to do?" Ayanna asked, slumping into a chair at the kitchen table where 3 generations of Ridge women had faced impossible decisions. The morning sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air between them. "What do you think your father would want?" Alyssa countered, employing her usual method of answering questions with questions. But this time, Ayanna heard the deeper inquiry beneath the surface. Not what Thomas Ridge, the man, would want, but what the role he had played demanded, what the accumulated weight of ancestry and obligation required. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of research and revelation. Ayanna found herself diving deep into Cherokee history, not the sanitized version taught in schools, but the complex, painful truth preserved in family stories and scholarly works hidden in university libraries. She learned about the gold mines that had triggered the Georgia Gold Rush and ultimately led to the Indian Removal Act. She discovered accounts of Cherokee families who had hidden their wealth rather than see it stolen, who had died rather than reveal the locations of gold deposits and caches. The historical parallel to her current situation was impossible to ignore. Once again, Cherokee wealth was hidden to prevent its theft, and once again, A young person was faced with the choice between preservation and assimilation, between maintaining secrets and seeking the false safety of transparency. The federal agents who might be searching for her father's network were spiritual descendants of the soldiers who had forced her ancestors from their homes, and the legal system that promised justice was the same one that had sanctioned genocide under the color of law. But understanding history didn't make her present choices any clearer. The gold in the cellar represented possibilities that pulled in contradictory directions. She could report it to authorities, potentially clearing her family's name while losing resources that could support Cherokee cultural preservation for generations. She could attempt to continue her father's work, risking federal prosecution and the destruction of everything her family had built. She could try to find a middle path, working within the system while secretly maintaining the hidden wealth, but that would require skills and connections she didn't possess. The isolation of keeping such a momentous secret began to affect every aspect of Ayanna's life. At school, she found herself unable to relate to classmates worried about homecoming dances and college applications, when she was grappling with questions of federal law and cultural preservation. Her grades began to slip as she spent nights researching legal precedents and international agreements on indigenous cultural property rights. Teachers who had once praised her potential began expressing concern about her sudden disengagement, but she couldn't explain that she was receiving an education far more relevant than anything in their curriculum. Her relationship with her best friend, Sarah Blackwater, became particularly strained. Sarah was everything Ayanna had once aspired to be, assimilated enough to succeed in mainstream society, while maintaining just enough Cherokee identity to qualify for scholarships and diversity programs. She had plans for pre-law at Duke, followed by a career that would let her advocate for Native rights within the established system. Once, Ayanna had envied Sarah's clear path and confident ambitions. Now she saw them as naive accommodations to a structure designed to limit indigenous power while maintaining the illusion of progress. "You're being weird," Sarah told her during lunch, picking at a salad while Ayanna stared unseeing at her untouched sandwich. "Ever since October, you've been like a completely different person. Is this about your dad? Because there are people you can talk to, you know. The school has counselors and the tribe has programs for." "I'm fine," Ayanna interrupted, the lie bitter on her tongue. She wanted desperately to confide in someone, to share the weight of knowledge that threatened to crush her. But her father's letter had been explicit about the danger of trust, the way information could spread through communities like wildfire, reaching ears that might use it for destruction rather than preservation. Even Sarah, with her good intentions and Cherokee blood, might inadvertently reveal something to the wrong person at the wrong time. The surveillance she had initially attributed to paranoia proved to be real. A man in a federal license plate sedan appeared with increasing frequency near their property, sometimes parking at the scenic overlook that provided a clear view of their house, sometimes driving slowly past as if lost. Ayanna photographed him with her phone, capturing images of a middle-aged white man with the bland, forgettable features that screamed government agent. He never approached directly, never made contact, but his presence was a constant reminder that her father's past actions had present consequences. More disturbing were the signs that someone had been on their property. Footprints in the garden that didn't match any of their shoes, disturbed dust patterns in the barn, tools moved slightly from where they had been left. Someone was searching for something, being careful but not quite careful enough to avoid detection by someone who had grown up tracking deer through these forests. Ayanna began varying her routines, taking different routes home from school, checking for surveillance, feeling like a character in a spy novel, except the consequences were devastatingly real. It was Alyssa who finally forced the issue, though in her characteristic indirect way. One evening, as they prepared dinner together in comfortable silence, she began telling a story Ayanna had never heard before. It was about Ayanna's great-great-grandmother, who had been a young woman during the removal period. Rather than report to the stockades for deportation, she had hidden in a cave system in these very mountains, protected by Cherokee who had already assimilated and by white allies who risked their own safety to help. She stayed hidden for 3 years, Alysse said, her hands never pausing in their preparation of being bred. 3 years of darkness and fear, of depending on others for food and news, of knowing that discovery meant death or worse. But she preserved something important, not just her own life, but knowledge of where the ceremonial objects had been hidden, where the gold from the old mines had been cached. Without her courage, without her willingness to live in shadows, 7 sacred bundles would have been lost forever. The parallel was clear, even if unstated. Yana's father had chosen a form of hiding, preserving knowledge and resources that might otherwise be lost. The question was whether Ayana had the strength to continue that preservation, to accept the isolation and danger that came with being a keeper of secrets. The story suggested that such courage ran in her bloodline, but genetic inheritance was no guarantee of individual choice. That night, Ayana returned to the cellar alone, sitting in the darkness with only the chest of gold for company. She ran her fingers over the artifacts, feeling the weight of history in each piece. A gorget that might have been worn by a beloved clan mother, carried west on the Trail of Tears, and somehow preserved through generations of poverty and persecution. A collection of trade silver that represented economic sovereignty in an era when Cherokee people were forbidden to own property. Gold coins that could have bought food during famines, medicine during epidemics, education during eras of forced ignorance, but had been kept hidden for some future moment of even greater need. The letter from her father took on new meaning with each reading. Between the lines of practical instruction about contacts and procedures, she began to see the emotional weight he had carried. The loneliness of keeping secrets from his own daughter, the fear that his work would endanger his family, the hope that someday the hidden wealth could be transformed into open support for Cherokee cultural renewal. He had made his choice in an impossible situation, and now that choice had become her inheritance along with the gold. A sound from above made her freeze, every muscle tensing with primordial fear. Footsteps crossed the floor of the house, too heavy to be Alysse's familiar tread. Someone was in their home, moving with the confident steps of authority or invasion. Yana killed her flashlight and huddled in the darkness, her hand finding the handle of a mattock that leaned against the wall, a tool that could serve as a weapon if necessary. The footsteps paused directly overhead, as if the intruder could sense her presence through the floorboards. Time stretched like taffy as Ayana waited, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, her breath shallow and controlled. This was the moment her father must have experienced. The instant when abstract danger became immediate threat, when theoretical choices crystallized into fight or flight or freeze. Then Alysse's voice came, muffled but recognizable, speaking to someone in a tone that suggested neither fear nor surprise. The footsteps moved away from the cellar area, and Ayana heard the front door open and close. She waited another 10 minutes before emerging, her legs shaky with adrenaline aftermath, to find her grandmother calmly washing dishes as if nothing had happened. "Federal agent," Alysse said without being asked. "Detective Harrison, looking for information about your father. I told him what I've told them all. Thomas went hiking and never came back. The mountains keep their secrets." She turned to look at Ayana, her dark eyes holding depths of knowledge and sorrow. But secrets have a way of surfacing, like bodies in a lake. The question is whether we control that emergence or let it control us. The encounter with federal law enforcement, even at one remove, catalyzed Ayana's decision-making process. She couldn't remain in limbo indefinitely, couldn't pretend that inaction was a form of action. The gold existed, the network existed, the federal investigation existed. These were facts that wouldn't change regardless of her choices. The only variable was how she would navigate among these fixed points, what path she would chart through the dangerous waters her father had left her to sail. She began with research, using skills learned in AP history to trace the provenance of items in the chest. Some pieces were easier than others. Museum databases had been digitized, and she could match artifacts to catalog descriptions of items that had mysteriously vanished from private collections. Others required deeper investigation, connecting with Cherokee historians and elders who maintained oral records of what had been lost and when. Each confirmed connection was both a victory and a complication, proof of her father's success in recovering stolen heritage, but also evidence of crimes that had no statute of limitations. The modern gold was more problematic. Federal Reserve notes could be traced through serial numbers, gold coins through mint marks and dates. If her father's network had been converting recovered artifacts into fungible assets, they had been careful but not perfect. There were patterns in the dates and sources that suggested systematic activity over decades, the kind of pattern that forensic accountants could use to build a prosecution case if they ever got access to this evidence. But it was the human network that proved most complex to unravel. Her father's letter had included contact protocols for reaching other members of the artifact recovery network, but these were obviously compromised by the federal investigation. Making contact risked exposing herself and others to law enforcement scrutiny. Not making contact meant losing access to the expertise and support that might help her navigate this situation. It was a classic double bind, the kind that had trapped indigenous peoples since first contact with European colonizers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Joseph Swimmer, the director of the Cherokee Cultural Center where Ayanna had volunteered, approached her after a particularly distracted shift sorting donated books. He was a quiet man in his 50s, the kind of person who faded into backgrounds and was easily forgotten, which Ayanna was beginning to recognize as a valuable trait for someone involved in cultural preservation work. "Your father was a good man," Joseph said without preamble, his voice low enough that only Ayanna could hear. He understood that sometimes preservation requires action that others might not approve of. The question is whether you've inherited his understanding along with other things. The careful phrasing, the meaningful pause, the steady gaze that seemed to see through her attempted poker face, all of it suggested that Joseph knew more than he was saying. Yana felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She could deny knowledge, maintain her pretense of ignorance, stay safe in her isolation. Or she could take the terrifying leap of trust that might lead to either salvation or destruction. "I understand more than I did," she said finally, matching his careful tone. But understanding and knowing what to do with that understanding are different things. Joseph nodded slowly, as if she had passed some kind of test. "The center closes at 5. Sometimes I stay late to work on special projects, things that require discretion. If someone were to knock on the back door around 6, when the parking lot is empty and the security cameras are conveniently offline for maintenance, I might be available for consultation about historical preservation challenges." The meeting that evening opened doors Ayanna hadn't even known existed. Joseph, it turned out, was part of the legitimate face of the network her father had helped create. While Thomas Ridge and others had engaged in direct action to recover stolen artifacts, people like Joseph worked within the system to create legal pathways for repatriation. Museums donated items of questionable provenance to the cultural center. Private collectors made tax-deductible gifts of artifacts they could no longer display without controversy. And gradually, piece by piece, Cherokee heritage returned home. "Your father's methods were necessary but unsustainable," Joseph explained, showing Ayanna databases that tracked both legally repatriated items and those still held in private collections. Every recovery operation increased the risk of exposure, and exposure would have destroyed not just the individuals involved, but the entire repatriation movement. "We've spent 3 years trying to create enough legal distance from the direct action wing to protect the legitimate operations." The solution Joseph proposed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to hide or personally distribute the gold, Ayanna could work through established channels to transform it into legitimate funding for cultural preservation. Anonymous donations to the cultural center, strategic purchases of land containing sacred sites, scholarship funds for Cherokee students studying museum science and cultural preservation. All of it could be accomplished without directly linking the wealth to its problematic origins. But this approach required trusting Joseph and his network, required believing that they wouldn't simply take the gold for their own purposes or expose Ayanna to protect themselves. It also meant accepting that she couldn't control how the resources would be used, that community decision-making would replace individual action. For someone raised in the American tradition of individual autonomy, this surrender of control was almost as difficult as the legal risks. Ulysses' counsel, when sought, was characteristically oblique. "The river flows strongest when many streams join together," she said, working on a beadwork project that seemed to occupy her hands while freeing her mind for deeper contemplation. But streams must choose their channels carefully, or they disappear into dry ground. Translation: collective action was powerful, but only when the collective could be trusted. The question was how to evaluate that trust when everyone involved had practiced deception as a survival strategy. Even Joseph, with his mild manner and cultural center credentials, might be playing a longer game than he revealed. The federal investigation that had driven her father underground might have turned former allies into informants, might have compromised networks that appeared intact. Ayanna decided to test the waters with a small gesture. She selected a single gold coin from the chest, one with no particular historical significance, and donated it anonymously to the Cultural Center's building fund. She watched for reactions, for signs that this modest gift had triggered unwanted attention or unusual behavior. When nothing happened beyond a routine thank you letter for anonymous donors, she felt marginally more confident about Joseph's discretion. But paranoia had become her constant companion. She varied her routes obsessively, checked for surveillance devices in her belongings, used burner phones for sensitive communications. The skills her father had taught her for tracking deer in the forest, attention to disturbed vegetation, awareness of sight lines, recognition of patterns that didn't belong became urban survival tools. She was 17 years old and living like a fugitive, despite having committed no crimes beyond knowing where her father had hidden his secrets. The federal surveillance intensified as winter approached. Detective Harrison became a regular presence in their small community, interviewing Cherokee families about their connections to Thomas Ridge, asking questions about artifacts and cultural preservation activities. His approach was friendly, even sympathetic, presenting himself as someone trying to help recover stolen Cherokee heritage rather than prosecute those who had recovered it. But Ayanna recognized the technique from crime shows. Build rapport, create trust, wait for someone to make a mistake. Several families reported that Harrison had shown particular interest in young people who had been involved with cultural programs, anyone who might have learned traditional skills that could be used in artifact identification and recovery. He seemed to be operating on the theory that the network had recruited Cherokee youth, training them in a twisted apprenticeship program for cultural theft. The irony of a federal agent being concerned about the theft of Cherokee property was not lost on anyone with a sense of history. Sarah Blackwater became one of Harrison's informal sources, though she probably didn't realize it. Her casual mentions of Ayanna's changed behavior, her observations about which families seemed to have unexplained resources, her innocent questions about traditional crafts and their market value, all of it fed into a pattern that Harrison was constructing. Ayanna watched her former best friend become an unwitting informant and felt another piece of her old life fall away. The breaking point came in January, when Ayanna discovered that someone had been in the cellar. Nothing was missing, but items had been moved, photographed, cataloged by someone who knew what they were looking at. The violation of that sacred space, the knowledge that her father's legacy had been exposed to unknown eyes, triggered a rage she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. The careful control she had maintained for months shattered, replaced by a burning need for action. She confronted Joseph that evening, her fury barely contained as she demanded to know who had access to their property, who could have betrayed the secret location. His calm response, that it had been necessary to document the artifacts for eventual repatriation, that trusted scholars needed to verify authenticity, only fueled her anger. The network had made decisions about her inheritance without consulting her, had treated her like a child, despite the adult responsibilities they had placed on her shoulders. "You're just like the museums," she accused, her voice shaking with emotion. "Taking what isn't yours, deciding what's best for everyone else, preserving things in ways that destroy their meaning. My father hid that gold to keep it safe from people who think they know better, and you've turned it into just another collection to be cataloged and distributed by committee." Joseph absorbed her anger without defensiveness, waiting until she had exhausted her immediate fury before responding. "Your father was my friend," he said quietly. "We worked together for 15 years, planning operations, sharing risks, building something we hoped would outlast us both. He didn't hide that gold from the network. He hid it for the network, knowing that someday it would need to surface safely. The documentation is part of that safety, creating a paper trail that transforms theft into repatriation." The logic was sound, but logic had little power over the emotional trauma of violation. Gianna had spent months protecting a secret that wasn't even secret, guarding a treasure that others were already managing. The sense of purpose that had sustained her through isolation and fear evaporated, leaving behind a bitter recognition of her own insignificance in larger plans she neither understood nor controlled. She withdrew from everyone after that, attending school mechanically, avoiding the cultural center, barely speaking even to Alysse. The gold in the cellar became a weight she couldn't bear to acknowledge, representing not potential or responsibility, but the futility of individual action against institutional power. Whether those institutions were federal law enforcement or Cherokee cultural networks seemed irrelevant. Both treated her as a piece to be moved rather than a person with agency. It was during this period of despair that she began to truly understand her father's writings. Beyond the practical instructions and historical context, his letter contained a deeper message about the nature of resistance and preservation. He had known that individual action was ultimately unsustainable, that networks could be compromised, that every secret eventually surfaces. But he had acted anyway, not from hope of permanent success, but from recognition that the attempt itself was a form of victory. "The gold doesn't matter," he had written in a passage she had initially overlooked. "What matters is that we tried to preserve it, that we refused to accept its loss as inevitable. Each generation faces the same choice: surrender to systems designed to eliminate us, or resist in whatever ways we can manage. The resistance itself is our heritage, more precious than any artifact." This philosophy reframed Ayana's understanding of recent events. The network's appropriation of her discovery wasn't betrayal but continuation, the next generation taking up responsibilities that the previous one could no longer maintain. Her anger had been real and valid, but it had also been narrow, focused on personal ownership rather than collective preservation. The Cherokee way, the way her father had ultimately chosen despite his lone wolf tactics, was communal rather than individual. But understanding didn't immediately translate to acceptance. Gianna spent weeks wrestling with the implications of joining the network formally, of transforming from unwilling inheritor to active participant. It would mean abandoning dreams of leaving the mountains for college, of pursuing a life unencumbered by the weight of cultural preservation. It would mean accepting surveillance and suspicion as permanent features of her existence, knowing that federal interest in her family wouldn't disappear simply because she chose legitimate channels for her work. The decision was made for her when Detective Harrison finally made his move. He arrived at their house with a search warrant, accompanied by a team of federal agents who methodically dismantled 3 generations of careful living. They found the cellar, of course. That had been inevitable from the moment someone else had entered it. But they found it empty. The gold already moved through channels Ayanna didn't know, leaving only dust and echoes of what had been. Harrison's frustration was palpable as he questioned Ayanna and Alisy, his friendly mask slipping to reveal the institutional violence beneath. He knew they were lying, knew that evidence had been moved, knew that networks were protecting each other through coordinated obstruction. But knowing and proving were different things, and the warrant's limitations prevented him from expanding his search to other properties or financial records without additional evidence. "Your father stole millions of dollars worth of cultural artifacts," Harrison said during a break in questioning, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of investigation. He justified it with politics and history, but theft is theft. You can help us recover those items for proper repatriation, or you can be complicit in their continued concealment. The choice is yours, but understand that we won't stop looking just because this search came up empty. Ayanna met his gaze steadily, drawing on strength she hadn't known she possessed. "My father believed that Cherokee heritage belongs to Cherokee people," she said, her voice carrying the formal cadence she had learned from Alisy. "If items have been recovered from those who had no right to possess them, then justice has been served regardless of your paperwork and procedures. We've survived worse than federal investigations, Detective Harrison. We'll survive this too." The aftermath of the raid transformed Ayanna from suspicious individual to known activist. Her name appeared in federal databases. Her activities were monitored. Her future possibilities narrowed to paths that accommodated permanent surveillance. But it also freed her from the burden of secrecy, allowed her to work openly for cultural preservation within legal boundaries that the network had carefully constructed. The gold might be gone, but its purpose remained, transformed into scholarships and land purchases and museum programs that slowly, steadily reclaimed Cherokee heritage. She graduated high school with honors diminished by her junior year struggles, but still sufficient for acceptance to the state university's museum studies program. The scholarship that made attendance possible came from an anonymous donor, though Ayanna recognized the hand of the network in its precise targeting of her needs. She studied anthropology and law, learning the languages of power that could be used to protect indigenous interests within settler colonial systems. During holiday breaks, she returned to the mountains and worked with Joseph at the Cultural Center, now as an acknowledged member of the network rather than an accidental inheritor. She learned the delicate balance between legal and extralegal action, the ways that legitimate institutions could provide cover for more aggressive repatriation efforts. She met others like herself, young Cherokee people who had been recruited or had stumbled into the movement, all working to preserve what previous generations had nearly lost. The federal investigation continued, Harrison's team following paper trails and financial transfers with dogged persistence. But the network had learned from Thomas Ridge's mistakes, compartmentalizing information and resources so that no single discovery could compromise the whole. Artifacts surfaced in cultural centers and tribal museums with documentation that satisfied legal requirements while obscuring their recovery methods. Private collectors found themselves facing public pressure to donate items of dubious provenance, encouraged by campaigns that the network orchestrated through legitimate advocacy channels. Ayanna's role evolved from passive inheritor to active strategist, her youth and apparent innocence providing cover for sophisticated operations. She could attend estate sales and auctions without triggering suspicion, could build relationships with collectors' children who might be more sympathetic to repatriation than their parents. Her scholarship research provided legitimate reasons to access museum databases and private collections, mapping the diaspora of Cherokee artifacts across institutions worldwide. The work was slow, often frustrating, marked by more failures than successes. For every item recovered, dozens remained in foreign hands. For every sympathetic contact cultivated, others proved hostile to indigenous claims. The legal system that supposedly protected cultural heritage was riddled with loopholes that favored collectors over communities. But each small victory built on the last, creating momentum that Thomas Ridge's generation could only have dreamed of achieving. 5 years after discovering the gold, Ayanna stood in the Cherokee Nation's new cultural preservation facility, watching as a collection of recovered artifacts was formally installed. Among them were pieces she recognized from that first shocking glimpse in the cellar, items that had traveled through shadow networks and legal channels to reach this moment of homecoming. Detective Harrison was there too, his investigation having evolved into grudging cooperation with legitimate repatriation efforts, though he still pursued leads on the illegal network with diminished resources and enthusiasm. "Your father would be proud," Joseph said, standing beside her as tribal elders conducted blessing ceremonies for the returned items. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've grown into the role he left for you." Ayanna thought of Thomas Ridge, still in hiding somewhere, still working for the cause that had cost him his official existence. They had established contact through encrypted channels, daughter and father building a relationship mediated by security protocols and careful language. He had become a ghost in the machine of cultural preservation, feeding intelligence to the network from whatever shadow life he had constructed. His sacrifice had made possible the legitimacy that the next generation enjoyed, though the price had been higher than anyone should have to pay. "He gave me a choice," Ayanna reflected, watching as young Cherokee children pressed their faces against display cases, seeing their heritage preserved and honored. But every choice was really the same choice, whether to accept loss or fight for preservation. The gold was just the medium, the message was resistance itself. The ceremony concluded with traditional songs that echoed through the modern facility, ancient words finding new resonance in climate-controlled spaces designed to preserve them for future generations. Ayanna joined her voice to the chorus, no longer the frightened teenager who had discovered blood on a cellar door, but not yet the elder who would someday guide others through similar transformations. She was simply another link in the chain of preservation, another generation refusing to let their heritage slip away into museums and private collections, where it would be admired but not lived. Outside, the Great Smoky Mountains stood unchanged, their ancient profiles holding secrets that no federal investigation could uncover. Somewhere in their vastness, other caches might wait for discovery, other networks might operate in shadows, other young people might face impossible choices about preserving their heritage. The cycle would continue, as it had since first contact, as it would until indigenous sovereignty was more than a legal fiction. But for now, in this moment, Ayanna Ridge stood in a room full of recovered treasures and felt the weight of her father's legacy transform into something sustainable. The hero's journey that had begun with a bloodstain and a hidden chest of gold had led not to individual triumph, but to collective resilience. The real treasure had never been the gold itself, but the network of people willing to risk everything for cultural preservation, the bonds of trust and purpose that connected generations across time and space. The mountains would keep their secrets, the networks would continue their work, and Cherokee heritage would survive another generation's challenges. It was not a perfect ending. There were no perfect endings in the ongoing story of indigenous resistance, but it was enough. Ayanna had found her place in the larger narrative, had transformed from victim of circumstances to agent of change, had learned that true heroism lay not in individual achievement but in collective perseverance. As she left the cultural center that evening, driving through mountain passes that her ancestors had walked for millennia, Ayanna carried with her the knowledge that some journeys never truly end. They simply pass from one traveler to the next, each generation adding their own chapters to an ongoing story of survival, resistance, and hope. The gold was gone, transformed into purposes her father had envisioned, but the spirit that had hidden and preserved it lived on in every artifact recovered, every tradition maintained, every young Cherokee who chose preservation over assimilation. The hero's journey ends where it began, but the hero who returns is transformed by their trials. Gianna Ridge had left her ordinary world as a teenager, burdened by an unwanted inheritance, and returned as a woman who understood that inheritance as opportunity. The mountains that had once seemed like prison walls now stood as guardians of possibility, holding space for future generations to discover their own hidden treasures and make their own impossible choices in the eternal struggle between preservation and loss. But the story was far from over. 10 years after that first discovery, Ayanna received a message that shattered the carefully constructed life she had built. The encryption was familiar, the protocols exactly what her father had taught her, but the sender was impossible. Thomas Ridge himself, breaking years of silence with an urgency that transmitted even through digital text. The removal codex has surfaced. Harrison knows. Come immediately. The removal codex was a legend even within the network, a supposedly comprehensive record of all Cherokee wealth hidden during the Trail of Tears period. Written in a mixture of Cherokee syllabary and coded English, it allegedly contained locations of caches throughout the Southeast, detailed inventories of ceremonial objects, and most importantly, legal documentation that could support land claims worth billions in modern currency. Most network members considered it myth, a composite fantasy built from fragments of real documents and wishful thinking. Gianna's academic training had taught her to be skeptical of such legendary artifacts. Her experience in the network had shown her that reality was usually more complex and less dramatic than stories suggested. But her father had never been given to fantasy or exaggeration. If he said the codex existed and was in danger, then she had to act on that information regardless of her doubts. She arranged emergency leave from her position as assistant curator of indigenous collections at the Smithsonian, a job that provided perfect cover for network activities while allowing her to identify repatriation opportunities within one of America's most prestigious institutions. Her colleagues accepted her vague explanations about family emergencies, accustomed to her occasional mysterious absences. Only Marcus Thompson, her closest ally within the museum and secretly another network member, recognized the signs of an operation beginning. "Be careful," Marcus warned, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by genuine concern. "Harrison's been promoted since your last encounter. He has resources now, entire task forces dedicated to artifact trafficking, and he has a particular interest in your family that goes beyond professional duty. Whatever you're walking into, assume it's a trap until proven otherwise." The journey back to Cherokee territory took on the quality of pilgrimage, each mile stripping away the professional persona she had cultivated until only the mountain girl remained. She found herself checking for surveillance with skills she thought she had abandoned, noting vehicles that appeared too frequently in her mirrors, memorizing faces at rest stops. The paranoia of her youth returned with disturbing ease, as if it had been dormant rather than cured. She met her father at a location that existed in no official records, a cabin deep in the national forest, accessible only by foot trails that didn't appear on any maps. The hike took 6 hours through terrain that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen, following markers that only someone raised in these mountains would recognize. By the time she reached the cabin, night had fallen and exhaustion weighted her limbs, but adrenaline kept her alert for the reunion a decade in the making. Thomas Ridge had aged more than 10 years should account for. His hair, once black as crow feathers, had gone completely gray. Lines mapped his face like elevation markers on the mountains he had made his home. But his eyes remained sharp, holding the same intensity that had made him such an effective advocate and operative. He embraced his daughter briefly, efficiently, as if prolonged contact might make them both too vulnerable. "You look well," he said, studying her with parental concern overlaid by professional assessment. "The city suits you better than I expected, but then you always were adaptable." "You look like a ghost," Gianna replied, noting the careful way he moved, the evidence of injuries that hadn't healed properly. "Which I suppose you are. Why break cover now? What makes this codex worth the risk of contact?" Instead of answering directly, Thomas led her into the cabin's main room, where documents covered every surface in organized chaos. Maps marked with pins and strings showed connections between locations across multiple states. Photographs of manuscript pages revealed text in multiple languages and scripts. Financial records traced property transfers going back centuries. At the center of it all was a leather-bound journal that seemed to pulse with significance despite its mundane appearance. "I've spent 10 years following threads," Thomas explained, gesturing at the accumulated evidence. Every recovered artifact, every family story, every historical inconsistency pointed toward something larger. The network always assumed we were recovering scattered pieces, individual caches hidden by desperate families. But what if it was coordinated? What if the removal wasn't just cultural genocide, but also the largest theft in American history, and our ancestors documented it all? He opened the journal to reveal pages of dense text in multiple hands, Cherokee syllabary mixed with English, Spanish, and what appeared to be Masonic cipher. The paper was clearly old but remarkably preserved, as if it had been stored with careful attention to conservation. Marginal notes in different inks suggested multiple generations had added to the original text, creating layers of meaning that would take experts years to fully decode. "This is just one volume of at least 12, Thomas continued, his voice carrying the reverence of someone handling sacred text. "Together, they document not just hidden gold but legal challenges to the removal itself, treaties that were suppressed, land deals that were fraudulent even by 1830 standards." The Cherokee Nation didn't just hide wealth, they hid evidence that could overturn 2 centuries of legal precedent. The implications were staggering. If authentic, the Codex could support land claims that would reshape the Southeast, invalidate property titles that had been considered settled for generations, and transfer billions in wealth back to Cherokee control. It was the kind of discovery that governments would kill to suppress, that corporations built on stolen land would do anything to destroy. No wonder Harrison was interested. The Codex represented an existential threat to the entire legal framework of American expansion. "How did you find it?" Iana asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Her father's network hadn't just been recovering artifacts, they had been searching for this ultimate prize, following clues embedded in each recovered piece. "I didn't find it," Thomas admitted. "It found me. Or rather, its guardians decided it was time to bring it into the light. There's another network, Ayana, older and more secret than ours. Families who have been protecting the Codex for 7 generations, waiting for the right moment to reveal its existence. They've watched our work, tested our commitment, and finally decided we might be worthy of the responsibility." A sound outside made them both freeze, hands moving to weapons with practiced ease. But it was only wind in the trees, the mountains themselves seeming to whisper warnings about the dangerous knowledge contained in the cabin. Yana found herself thinking of all the secure facilities she had worked in, all the climate-controlled vaults and digital security systems, and how vulnerable they seemed compared to a hidden cabin protected by geography and secrecy. "The Guardians are dying out," Thomas continued once they confirmed the false alarm. "Their children have assimilated, moved to cities, lost the languages needed to read the Codex. They need us to preserve it, to translate it, to act on its information before it becomes truly mythical. But Harrison has informants everywhere, even among the old families. He knows something significant is moving, even if he doesn't know exactly what. The next hours were spent in intensive education, Thomas downloading a decade of research into his daughter's academically trained mind. The Codex wasn't just a historical document but a living tradition, with each generation of guardians adding their own discoveries and interpretations. Some entries were straightforward treasure maps, marking caches that might or might not still exist. Others were legal arguments that would require teams of lawyers to properly deploy. Still others seemed to be spiritual or ceremonial in nature, preserving traditions that mainstream Cherokee culture had been forced to abandon. "The gold in our cellar was nothing compared to this," Thomas said as dawn light began filtering through the cabin windows. "That was personal wealth, family resources. This documents the collective wealth of an entire nation, stolen through legal violence and hidden against future need. The question is whether we can surface it without triggering a backlash that destroys everything we've worked to build." Iana understood the dilemma intimately. The network had succeeded partly by working quietly, recovering artifacts one at a time, building legal precedent slowly. The Codex would shatter that careful approach, forcing confrontations that the Cherokee Nation might not be prepared to win. It could unite indigenous peoples across the continent in shared purpose, or it could provoke a reaction that set back sovereignty movements by decades. "What do the Guardians want?" she asked, recognizing that the decision wasn't solely theirs to make. Surely, they didn't preserve this for 7 generations just to have us make unilateral decisions about its use. "They want justice," Thomas replied simply. "But they disagree on what that means. Some want to use the Codex to support legal challenges, to work within the system for recognition and restitution. Others want to release it publicly, to shame the government and corporations into action. A few want to keep it hidden forever, believing that its power lies in its secrecy. We're caught in the middle of a debate that's been ongoing since the removal itself." The sound of helicopters in the distance ended their philosophical discussion. Military-grade aircraft didn't patrol national forests without reason, and both Thomas and Ayanna knew that reason was likely them. Whether Harrison had tracked her journey or had surveillance on the cabin itself, their location was compromised. The decade of careful hiding was over, and decisions that should have taken months of consideration would have to be made in minutes. "Take the journal," Thomas ordered, already moving to pack essential documents while destroying others. "Get it to Marcus at the Smithsonian. He'll know how to authenticate it without triggering federal attention. I'll take the rest and go deeper underground, try to connect with the other Guardians before Harrison finds them." "We should stay together," Gianna protested even as she obeyed, carefully wrapping the journal in waterproof material. "You've been alone too long, the network can protect you now." Her father's smile was sad and proud simultaneously. "The network can protect the Codex, that's what matters. I'm already a ghost, Iana. Let me haunt Harrison while you do the real work. Just promise me you'll be smarter than I was, that you'll find a way to use this knowledge without destroying yourself in the process." The helicopters were getting closer, their rotor wash beginning to disturb the forest canopy. Iana embraced her father one last time, knowing it might truly be the last, then took the journal and ran. Behind her, she heard Thomas beginning his own evacuation, taking a different route that would lead pursuers away from her path. It was a tactic as old as warfare itself. Divide to conquer, sacrifice the few to save the many. The flight through the forest tested every skill her father had taught her. She moved like her ancestors had during the removal, when Cherokee people who refused deportation had hidden in these same mountains. Every cave could be shelter or trap, every stream could hide her trail or lead pursuers directly to her. The journal's weight in her pack seemed to increase with each mile, as if the knowledge it contained had physical mass. She emerged from the forest 2 days later, 20 miles from where she had entered, at a trailhead popular with tourists. Her appearance was disheveled enough to be concerning but not suspicious, just another hiker who had gotten in over her head. The rental car she had strategically placed was unmolested, and she drove away with careful attention to speed limits and traffic laws. The most dangerous cargo in America hidden in a backpack full of camping gear. The journey to Washington, D.C. took on the quality of nightmare. Every police car a potential threat, every rest stop a possible ambush. She contacted Marcus through prearranged codes, setting up a meeting that would appear routine to any surveillance. The Smithsonian received thousands of artifacts for evaluation each year. One more would hardly attract attention, especially when delivered by a known staff member. But Harrison was waiting at her apartment, sitting in her living room as if he had every right to be there. The years had been kinder to him than to her father, adding authority rather than wear to his features. He didn't rise when she entered, didn't reach for weapons or handcuffs. He simply watched her with the patience of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere left to run. "Ms. Ridge," he said pleasantly, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. "I thought it was time we had an honest conversation about your family's activities. No lawyers, no warrants, just two people who understand that we're playing a game with very high stakes." Ayanna set down her pack carefully, noting the slight tension in Harrison's shoulders that suggested he knew what it contained. "I'm not sure we have anything to discuss, Detective. My family's legal troubles are well documented, and I've cooperated with every legitimate inquiry." "Agent," Harrison corrected mildly. "I've been promoted since our last encounter, and I think we both know that your cooperation has been exactly as extensive as legally required and not 1 inch further, which I respect, actually. You've played the game well, better than your father in many ways. But the game is changing, and I thought you should know the new rules." He produced a tablet from his briefcase, swiping through documents that made Ayanna's blood run cold. Financial records of the network's legitimate operations, photographs of members who thought their identities were secret, transcripts of encrypted communications that should have been unbreakable. The federal government had been busier than anyone in the network had realized, building a comprehensive picture of their activities that went far beyond artifact recovery. "We could arrest half the Cherokee Nation tomorrow," Harrison said conversationally, setting aside the tablet. "Conspiracy, money laundering, trafficking in stolen goods, violation of enough federal statutes to ensure that your people's next 7 generations would be dealing with the consequences. But that's not what I want, and I don't think it's what you want either. What do you want?" Ayanna asked, though she suspected she already knew. The journal in her pack seemed to pulse with significance, as if it could sense the danger of the moment. "Partnership," Harrison replied, surprising her with the directness of it. "The days of federal agents raiding tribal lands are supposed to be over. We're in an era of cooperation, consultation, respect for sovereignty. But that requires trust, and trust requires transparency. Your network has recovered hundreds of artifacts that belong in museums that could educate the public about Cherokee culture. Instead, they disappear into private collections or tribal facilities that few people can access. The hypocrisy of a federal agent lecturing about stolen artifacts wasn't lost on Ayanna, but she recognized the offer beneath the rhetoric. Harrison was proposing a deal: legitimacy in exchange for control, freedom from prosecution in exchange for limiting the scope of recovery efforts. It was the same bargain indigenous peoples had been offered for centuries, always with the same results. "You're asking us to become our own museum keepers," she said, understanding the trap more fully. "To preserve our culture in ways that make it safe for consumption, that don't challenge the fundamental theft on which this country was built." Harrison's smile was genuinely appreciative. "You really are smarter than your father. Yes, that's exactly what I'm offering. The alternative is a series of prosecutions that will destroy the network, scatter the artifacts you've recovered, and set back Cherokee cultural preservation by decades. Your choice, Ms. Ridge, but choose quickly. My patience for this particular game is not infinite." The weight of the journal in her pack felt heavier than mountains. If Harrison knew about the codex, this was all theater, a performance designed to make her reveal its location. If he didn't, then revealing it would trigger exactly the crackdown he threatened. Either way, the knowledge it contained would be neutralized, transformed from revolutionary potential into academic curiosity. "I need time to consider your offer," Iana said, playing for time she didn't have. "The network doesn't operate on individual decisions. There would need to be consultations, consensus building." 24 hours, Harrison interrupted. "After that, the warrants I've been holding back get executed. Your apartment will be the first, so I'd suggest you think carefully about anything you might be storing here that could be misinterpreted." He left with the same casual authority he had displayed throughout the encounter, confident in his power and position. Iana waited until she was certain he was gone, then retrieved the journal and every other sensitive document in her apartment. She had safe houses, backup plans, contingencies for exactly this situation, but she had never imagined needing them all simultaneously. The meeting with Marcus took place in the museum's subbasement, in storage areas where surveillance was minimal and conversations could be private. He examined the journal with professional reverence, confirming its authenticity through tests that wouldn't damage the artifact. His excitement was palpable as he recognized the significance of what she had brought him, but it was tempered by awareness of the danger it represented. "This needs to be digitized immediately," he said, already planning preservation strategies. "Multiple copies, distributed storage, blockchain verification to prevent tampering. If this is genuine, and I believe it is, then it's the most important document in Cherokee history since Sequoia's syllabary." "Harrison knows something," Iana warned, explaining the agent's ultimatum. "Either he knows about the codex specifically, or he's fishing with a net big enough to catch whatever we're hiding. Either way, we have less than 20 hours to decide how to proceed." Marcus considered this, his academic mind wrestling with possibilities. "What if we don't choose?" he suggested slowly. "What if we make the decision irrelevant by putting it beyond anyone's control?" The plan he outlined was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than trying to control the codex's release or hide it from federal authorities, they would democratize it completely. Digital copies would be sent to every Cherokee citizen with an email address, posted on indigenous rights websites worldwide, submitted to international human rights organizations. The knowledge would become impossible to suppress, forcing everyone, federal government, tribal authorities, legal systems, to deal with its implications. "It's chaos," Iana protested even as she recognized the genius of it. "We'd lose any ability to control how the information is used, to prevent treasure hunters from destroying archaeological sites, to build legal cases properly. It could do more harm than good. Or it could change everything," Marcus countered. "The network has operated in shadows because we believed secrecy was necessary for success. But what if transparency is the ultimate weapon? What if making everyone complicit in the knowledge prevents anyone from suppressing it?" They worked through the night, scanning pages, creating encrypted copies, preparing for a simultaneous release that would make containment impossible. Other network members were contacted through secure channels, informed of the plan, given the opportunity to object or withdraw. The response was mixed but ultimately supportive. The time for half measures had passed, and everyone recognized that Harrison's ultimatum represented a turning point regardless of their response. As dawn approached and the 24-hour deadline loomed, Iana found herself thinking about her father, somewhere in the mountains, still running from authorities who would never stop pursuing him. She thought about her grandmother, who had passed 2 years ago with the satisfaction of seeing the cultural center flourish, but without knowing about the codex. She thought about 7 generations of guardians who had preserved this knowledge against impossible odds, and wondered if they would approve of this digital diaspora of their carefully protected secrets. "My ancestor hid in caves to preserve our traditions," she told Marcus, as they prepared to execute the release. My father hid in shadows to recover our artifacts. Maybe it's time for my generation to stop hiding altogether. The upload began at 11:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 23 minutes before Harrison's deadline. Within seconds, servers around the world began receiving copies of the Cherokee Removal Codex, spreading through networks faster than any authority could move to stop it. Social media exploded with fragments of text. Amateur historians began analyzing entries, treasure hunters started planning expeditions, lawyers began drafting briefs. Harrison's call came within minutes, his controlled fury evident even through the phone's speaker. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said, professional courtesy abandoned entirely. "The chaos this will cause, the violence it might trigger, the legal challenges that will tear communities apart. You've turned a manageable situation into a catastrophe." "We've turned a secret into history," Yana replied, surprising herself with the calmness she felt. "The catastrophe happened in 1838. We're just finally acknowledging its full scope. Your move, Agent Harrison. Arrest us all for telling the truth, or help us deal with the consequences of that truth constructively." The aftermath was everything Harrison had predicted and more. Some Cherokee citizens celebrated the revelation of their hidden heritage, while others mourned the loss of sacred secrets. Treasure hunters descended on the southeast like locusts, requiring increased security at potential cache sites. Legal challenges were filed in every jurisdiction, some legitimate attempts at restitution, others opportunistic grabs for wealth. The Cherokee Nation's government was forced to create entire departments to deal with codex-related issues, straining resources already stretched thin. But there were positive outcomes as well. Museums began voluntarily repatriating artifacts mentioned in the codex, hoping to avoid legal challenges. Universities created programs to study and translate the full document, employing Cherokee scholars who might otherwise have struggled to find academic positions. The international indigenous rights community rallied around the codex as proof of systematic cultural theft, strengthening movements worldwide. Yana found herself at the center of this storm, no longer able to operate in shadows but not entirely comfortable in the spotlight. She testified before congressional committees, consulted with tribal leaders, authenticated discoveries that matched codex entries. The work was exhausting but meaningful, transforming her from secret operative to public advocate. The skills learned in the network, careful documentation, strategic thinking, coalition building, proved just as valuable in open forums as they had in clandestine operations. Her father remained a ghost, though she occasionally received encrypted messages suggesting he was well and watching her progress with pride. Other network members emerged from shadows to take public roles, their expertise needed to manage the codex's revelations responsibly. Even Harrison, his investigation derailed by the public release, found himself working with rather than against the network, his knowledge of their operations making him valuable in preventing the worst excesses of codex fever. 1 year after the release, Ayanna stood at the site of a successfully recovered cache in North Georgia, watching as archaeologists carefully excavated gold and artifacts exactly where the codex had indicated they would be. The find would fund Cherokee language education programs for a generation, but more importantly, it validated the truth of her ancestors' records. The removers had thought they were destroying a people, but those people had documented their survival with meticulous care. "You did the right thing," Joseph Swimmer said, joining her at the excavation site. He had emerged as a senior statesman of the public network, his quiet wisdom now shared openly rather than in secret meetings. "Your father protected the knowledge, but you set it free. Both were necessary, each in its time." Ayanna wasn't sure if it had been right or simply necessary, if the chaos unleashed was worth the truths revealed. But as she watched young Cherokee students assist with the excavation, learning their history through direct engagement with physical evidence, She felt the generational weight beginning to lift. The secret was out, the burden shared, the future uncertain but full of possibility. The Codex had revealed more than gold. It had revealed the resilience of a people who refused to disappear, who documented their dispossession with the same care they documented their ceremonies. Every entry was an act of resistance, every preserved location a faith in future generations who might reclaim what was stolen. Gianna had become part of that reclamation, not through individual heroism, but through collective action that spanned centuries. As the sun set over the excavation site, painting the sky in shades of gold that echoed the metal being carefully extracted from the earth, Ayanna felt her phone buzz with a message. The encryption was familiar, the sender impossible to trace, but the content made her smile. "The mountains remember everything," her father wrote. "Thank you for helping them speak." The hero's journey had taken her from a cellar in Tennessee to the halls of Congress, from solitary secret keeper to public advocate, from carrying her father's burden to sharing it with an entire nation. The transformation was complete but ongoing, each day bringing new challenges and revelations as the Codex continued to reshape understanding of American history and Cherokee persistence. She thought of that morning years ago when she had discovered blood on the cellar door, when her ordinary life had shattered to reveal the extraordinary responsibilities beneath. That girl would never have imagined standing here, watching the systematic recovery of her people's heritage in full view of the world. But then, that girl hadn't understood that heroes aren't individuals who complete quests and return home unchanged. Heroes are ordinary people who choose to carry collective burdens, who transform personal inheritance into communal wealth, who understand that some journeys require entire peoples to complete. The excavation would continue for months, each artifact cataloged and studied before joining others in the Cherokee Nation's growing collections. The Codex would be analyzed for years, its entries spawning dissertations and legal briefs, treasure hunts and land claims. The network would evolve to meet new challenges, operating in daylight rather than darkness, but no less committed to the preservation and recovery of indigenous heritage. And somewhere in the mountains, Thomas Ridge continued his watch, the last ghost of an era when such work required shadows and sacrifice. His daughter had inherited his mission but transformed it, proving that preservation could coexist with transparency. That recovery didn't require isolation. The gold was no longer hidden but actively working for Cherokee futures, invested in education and cultural programs that would ensure no generation forgot their heritage again. Gianna Ridge had begun as an ordinary teenager thrust into extraordinary circumstances. She emerged as a bridge between past and future, between secret knowledge and public action, between individual inheritance and collective responsibility. Her journey proved that heroes don't complete circles but create spirals, returning to their origins at a higher level of understanding and capability. The mountains that had witnessed her transformation stood eternal, holding new secrets for future generations to discover, new tests for new heroes to face. The story of the Cherokee teen who found her father's hidden gold had become the story of a people reclaiming their hidden history, transforming personal discovery into collective awakening. It was a hero's journey measured not in individual achievement, but in communal restoration, not in secrets kept, but in truths revealed, not in gold hoarded, but in heritage shared. The journey continued with each artifact recovered, each codex entry translated, each young Cherokee who learned their history not as tragedy, but as triumph over impossible odds. In the end, the real treasure was never the gold itself, but the proof it represented. That Cherokee people had survived, had preserved, had planned for futures their oppressors never imagined they would see. Gianna Ridge had simply been the key that unlocked that proof, the bridge between preservation and revelation, the hero whose journey made countless other journeys possible. The mountains remembered everything, and finally, after centuries of silence, they were ready to tell their stories.